Hi. What you're about to watch is a real spur-of-the-moment, stray whim of an idea that I had. I had a long weekend and was thinking about some of my least favorite episodes of Doctor Who, and I realized there's a wide swath of episodes from this show that I have not watched in years, largely because I felt very dismissive of them. But, you know, my brain is a critical instrument that's always fluctuating and very fluid, and so I figured 2 or 3 or 4 or sometimes even 5 years is certainly a long enough grace period for my opinions on some of these episodes to have changed. So why not come at them from a new perspective? And why not make a video out of it, because otherwise I'm just doing this for myself. So, in what I'm sure is going against somebody's better judgment, I'm going to take the time to look at 17 different stories throughout the Russel T. Davies and Stephen Moffat eras of Doctor Who, all of which I've had a history of being very dismissive towards, and seeing which ones are better or worse than I remembered, and which ones are about the same. Now, with the list of episodes so long, I'm sure opinions are going to vary big time. So if you see me talking about an episode in the chapter list that you have strong feelings about, why don't you commiserate in the comments? Let me know what you think. There's enough episodes that I don't get to over the course of this video that I could easily make a follow-up one day. And if there's any interest in that idea, why don't you let me know about that in the comments too? There's not really any particular reason why I'm not tackling stories from the Chibnall era other than they're kinda too recent and my thoughts on those are pretty fresh. Who knows, maybe some Chibnall era episodes will end up in the follow-up video once I make that. But, ignoring that, let's start this long journey down memory lane with... The Unquiet Dead is Mark Gatiss' first story on the show, and anybody who's been following my Doctor Who stuff for a while knows that I've become increasingly unkind to Mark Gatiss. I've called him a complete hack, I've called him incapable of writing good Doctor Who episodes, and you know, I really want to, tone that down because I just feel like it's very unkind to sort of take that very glib, dismissive approach towards any writer. But, you know, The Unquiet Dead is one of his stronger scripts, I think you could argue. Mark Gatiss isn't like a lot of other writers where their stories have a lot of the same problems in common. The Unquiet Dead, I think, isn't a great story, but it's not necessarily emblematic of Gatiss' consistent failings as a writer, I don't think. It is emblematic of the problem that a lot of other stories in this video will have, which is, I think, one of the worst things the stories can do for me is have a premise that I think could be really interesting and really compelling if it went in a particular direction, and then pivot hard into something that I think is a lot more generic and less engaging on a thematic idea level. And I'm really wary about getting into the territory of judging a story for what I want it to be instead of what it is, because I don't want to do that. I want to base it on the execution. And if the story has an idea that I wouldn't have gone with, but it executes it well, then I do want to give it points for that. But The Unquiet Dead is a story that sets itself up as being this very interesting moral quandary. What if we have these lost, spiritual, gaseous creatures who need a place to live, and so they decide to inhabit human corpses? And we have this discussion between the Doctor and Rose that's really interesting, insofar as even if they're dead bodies, there is a degree of sanctity in not letting somebody's corpse basically be a vehicle for this other being, and the Doctor kind of shuts that down immediately with, like, this big picture, this is the way things work in the universe, you have to let go of some of your previously held moral beliefs as a human being. That conversation is at the heart of what makes this premise interesting for me. And the fact that we renege on that by doing the twist where it turns out the Gelf are actually just generically evil and there's really no moral dilemma to be explored here, we just have to blow up the bad guys in the end. That's really disappointing. I think this episode is really let down by its third act, and it feels like we maybe do that just so that Charles Dickens has some, like, plot stuff to do. Having Charles Dickens be here for a story about ghosts is, by itself, kind of interesting, and the biggest boon that I'll give this episode is that Charles Dickens and the Ninth Doctor have a really endearing, interesting character chemistry. All around, I'd say the characterization is the most engaging, most likable thing about this episode. Not just those two, but also Gwyneth and Rose. As someone who's historically been kind of cold on Rose Tyler as a character, she's actually very endearing here. Her character is very well written. I don't know, there's a quaintness to this episode that's really, quaintness for the whole of Series 1 of this show. The production values and Murray Gold's score. It's got a very sort of like 90s children's show kind of feel to the production. And it's not necessarily a bad thing. It makes Series 1 very distinct amongst the rest of this show. But yeah, as far as the writing goes, I can't help but feel like there's a really interesting, more meditative story here that really dives into the question of, is it okay to let a desperate species in need of transport get that via usurping dead bodies? And what about respect for the dead? And can we so easily just let go of that very human concept for the sake of these other creatures? And that aspect of it, plus the characters being so endearing, does make it one that's a little bit better than it was in my memory, but it's really, really so let down by the, ooh, they're just scary monsters twist that we decide to go with by the end. So yeah, not the strongest story, but far from a complete dud. Next up is... And New Earth is one that I think has aged about as well as the Unquiet Dead has. It's fine. It's got a lot of really stupid plot stuff in it. Like having the Force-grown clones be these living petri dishes that are just subjected to the endless torture of being infected with every disease known to man. That is an incredibly dark premise. It's a very interesting sci-fi concept. But the fact that they're like fully cognizant, communicative, self-aware individuals, and the plot mechanics of how we cure them and cure everyone at the end, it's just, it doesn't fly. It's very, very simple and contrived and forced. And really the thing that actually makes this episode worth it is Cassandra. Both in the sense that I like what we do with her character here, especially at the end, and in the sense that we've got Billy Piper and David Tennant taking turns playing Cassandra in each of those bodies throughout the episode. And Piper and Tennant are both just having a ball with it. It's maybe a little bit of a disservice to the 10th Doctor as a character to, in his second ever story, where Tennant clearly still hasn't worked out all the kinks in his performance and his take on this character, it's maybe a little bit of a disservice to then immediately inhabit that body with a completely different character, so Tennant has to give a completely different performance. And I mean, he does a great job, and you can tell that they're both having a lot of fun. But I always feel kind of bad for actors who come right onto a show and immediately have to do a body swap episode, because it's like you've barely been given the chance to even sort out the baseline version of the character that you're meant to be playing, before you suddenly have to do this very radical variation for large swaths of screen time. The face of Bo is here, and it feels very much like he's just here to set up a future appearance. The implementation of the face of Bo is honestly kind of weak. Like, he's the thing that brings the Doctor to this hospital, and it just feels a bit too convenient that Bo is here while Cassandra also happens to be here, and that just wasn't accounted for at all. And yeah, it just feels like a very odd plot device that I don't think needed to be in this story. But what really makes this one, what really sort of puts it above where it was in my memory, which was just completely dismissible, is the ending. And the ending is one that I always like, but it hits different, really, seeing it again, like seeing it with fresh eyes, because the ending where Cassandra in Chip's body goes back to tell herself how beautiful she is just really, really emotionally powerful. And the fact that it's Cassandra going into the body of one of the sick people and feeling some semblance of empathy for just how alone they've been and how deprived they've been of touch and contact and validation, and that moment of empathy being what turns the Doctor around on her and lets her have a moment of actual connection, to then be paid off in that ending where even while she's being sort of callous and a little bit vain, it's still clear that Cassandra was a person who had empathy from the beginning, and that empathy got so buried in her desire to just remain alive. And when she regains access to that empathy in the future is when she's finally able to say, okay, I've lived long enough, and my survival isn't the most important thing, and it's okay. It's time to let go. There's just really, really interesting, genuinely compelling, nuanced character work being done with Cassandra in this episode, and that's really what makes it for me. So yeah, this episode's plot is kind of dumb, but on a character writing level, it's really got some decent stuff in there, and the ending is straight up top tier episode endings. So yeah, I guess we move on to the next one then, which is Shakespeare Code is one I've never really disliked all that much. It's another one where I've kind of seen it as missed potential, just because I'm someone who always feels like Doctor Who should be as experimental as possible whenever it can, and it's weird because I love this show so much despite that rarely being what it is, but I've always liked the idea, especially when you've got an artist or a writer in particular as the focal point of an episode of this show, to lean into their style aesthetically or in the presentation. So we've got the Agatha Christie episode in Series 4, The Unicorn and the Wasp, and that's patterned as sort of a pastiche of an Agatha Christie story, and I think that's really fun, and I wish that historical figure episodes would lean into that more. I've always thought it would be so much fun if we got an episode about Shakespeare that was written entirely in verse, that's completely in iambic pentameter, in the style of a stage play. I feel like a lot of people wouldn't go for that, but that's the kind of out there decisions that I think this show could pull off. And I am not going to hold it against this episode for not doing that, because that would actually be me judging the episode more for what I wanted than for what it is. And for what it is, the Shakespeare Code is honestly a fine little entertaining romp. The main thing that sticks out for me, well, it's two things. The main thing that sticks out just in the context of this episode is the dynamic between the Doctor and Martha. I'm someone who's never really cared for the whole the Doctor is rebounding off of Rose, and he spends legitimately half of Series 3 not giving Martha the cold shoulder, but kind of keeping her at arm's length because he's reeling over Rose. And I get, for the audience who spent 2 series with Rose and is not yet acclimated to the idea that there can be a revolving door for companions, that's a point for them to empathize with. But as someone who did not have Rose as their first companion and was never really enamored with her, I always found it just very unfair to Martha. But I think this episode knows that, and I think the way that we characterize the Doctor is more nuanced and better with that than I've given it credit for. Because it feels like a lot of Series 3 is really just about showcasing Martha as A+ tier gold standard companion material. Like, really, on paper, there's few companions who are more competent, more charming, more ready for action than Martha Jones, and you can see the 10th Doctor realizing that. And there is part of him that just so immediately, completely takes to her, and you can see that part of him fighting with the part of him that is stuck on Rose and would feel like it's disrespecting Rose to replace her like that. And it's a dynamic that I chafe against initially, but when I think about it in those terms, I actually really like it, and it seems really smart. The other big thing that stuck out for me this episode was that I kind of really like the Carrionites as an idea for an antagonist, and I kind of wish that they were a species that showed up more than once on this show. Because I know that we've got these 3 Carrionites trapped, but it occurred to me that, there's some untapped potential in these guys to be a really unique, recurring adversary on this show. One, because I like the idea of having a Doctor Who baddie who shows up more than once, whose whole deal is rooted more in fantasy than it is science fiction. And 2, I really like the idea of bad guys whose whole thing is words and the power of language. That naturally makes them perfect for a Shakespeare episode, but I imagine that, you could bring these guys back for an episode about any writer, or a story about a politician, or somebody in media, and how language and narratives and the importance of words are to those kind of figures. You could tell a lot of really interesting stories that would be complemented by having a Carrionite as the bad guy. That said, this episode does try to science explain the magic of the Carrionites, and I don't think it works. The explanation that they give is that Carrionites learned to use language the way that humanity uses math, and so the way that if you have knowledge of math, you can do science things. If you have knowledge of language, you can do language science, which appears as magic. I don't know. The episode does not do a good job, I think, of really justifying that take. I'd rather we just not even bother trying to science explain it if it was going to be that vague and silly. I'd rather it just be, oh, they have language magic, it's language magic, and let the Doctor face off against that. Shakespeare himself, weirdly, is kind of an unremarkable presence in this episode. We pay lip service to the grief and madness that he had over the death of his son, but we really just don't do enough with that, and that's something that I do feel comfortable criticizing the episode on. I wish we'd done more to give Shakespeare a real personal stake here and make him more than just sort of just a fun little guest appearance. Make him a real character central to the emotion and the story of this episode. But yeah, that aside, Shakespeare Code is a pretty compelling, fun Dr. and Martha getting to know each other adventure, and yeah, it's pretty decent. So next up, The Lazarus Experiment. The Lazarus Experiment is like the first Thor movie, because I go back and forth on how much I like it or dislike it, every time I watch it. Because I remember my last 2 viewings of it. 2 viewings ago, I had a really good time with it. And then on my previous viewing, I didn't care for it at all. This watch, I actually enjoyed it a lot more. It's far from perfect, but as a fun little adventure with some interesting things to say about the desire to live on. Much like Cassandra New Earth, it's an episode that's about the human instinct to live indefinitely, and is that nature or is that a perversion of nature? Because I really love the discussion that Lazarus has with the Doctor in the cathedral, where the Doctor says that embracing death, or accepting death, is human nature, and Lazarus shoots back with, no, avoiding death is human nature. And I think there's something really interesting that this episode is doing, where it's not necessarily disagreeing with that premise. It's not saying inherently that wanting to live on and wanting to not die is a bad thing or an immoral thing, but it's placing your own life above those of others, because Lazarus so explicitly is laser focused on keeping himself alive, and he views other people as stepping stones to that end, and he is completely devoid of empathy. That goes beyond instinct. Like, the instinct to stay alive can only take you so far. You have to make the conscious choice to care about your life above those of others so much, to build a machine like this, to want to profit off of it, to say that it's fine even as you're leaving people as dried up husks in order for this to work, to still view that as a success. It's an episode that actually has some interesting things to say, and the Lazarus, like, giant scorpion monster is a genuinely off-putting, like, frightening monster design. Like, it's Uncanny Valley, like, intentionally, like, in an appropriate way. It looks actually scary. And again, Ten and Martha just have a really charming dynamic. The episode is paced pretty decently. It's a fun one. Anyway, next up. Now, this is hilarious to me because this is the beginning of a long stretch of stories from Series 6. If you're a really big fan of Series 6, I'm sorry. My memory has not been very kind to the batting average of Series 6. Starting with Curse of the Black Spot, though, this is another one that definitely has its issues. There are parts of this one that feel borderline first draft-y. Like, I'd say the biggest problem with it is just that the connective tissue isn't there. Like, it's a fun little pirate romp, and it actually feels like something that we could get in the classic series, with just how hard it's leaning into, like, those old school swashbuckling stereotypes and tropes and the set. I don't know, there's something about it that feels very 60s Who. And I really appreciate that. And I like the dynamic between the Doctor and Avery. They have a fun little, like, they begin butting heads, but then they slowly gain a sort of mutual respect. When I say, like, connective tissue is missing, I mean, like, we need a real moment where that mutual respect establishes itself, and I don't think it happens. Characters will make decisions that I don't think are really earned. Like, when Toby and Rory get taken by the Siren, and the Siren, who, up until this point, the Doctor has zero reason to believe that getting taken by the Siren doesn't mean that you just get disintegrated. Like, they're visualized as disintegrating. The Doctor has zero evidence to go on that the people who get taken by the Siren are alive somewhere or anywhere, but his solution is just, let's let the Siren take us. I don't know, it really seems like the Doctor, with nothing to go on but pure, blind hope, is just like, let's die and hope that we can get to Rory and Toby and the rest of the crew by just killing ourselves ostensibly. Like, I really need something to set up that the Doctor thinks the Siren is not just cold-bloodedly murdering folks. We set up in the episode that Toby, who is Avery's son, believes that he's a naval officer and is disillusioned with him, learning that he's a pirate, and we never really resolve that. Like, we just kind of end with that hasn't been addressed and they're okay now, and, like, they're all together on this alien spaceship. And I don't know, like, the premise of the Siren as, like, this medical hologram come from a ship that happens to be parked in the same, like, alternate dimensional space as the pirate ship. Like, they can only come through in reflections, so they can only come through in still water, and it's like, that's really interesting. Like, all of this stuff is a really cool, like, sci-fi way to explain like a mysterious ocean siren attacking a pirate ship, and like having the black spot be a tissue sample is interesting. This is a fun ride with some neat ideas, but I can't really call it a strong story, like really strong, because it's like cutting too many corners and taking a little bit too many cheats. I also think this is one of the stories where the Doctor, as written, is kind of strange and obnoxious. Like, I have a problem where the 11th Doctor slowly becomes more of a caricature of himself with time, and I feel like that starts in Series 6, and in a story like this, he's very loosey-goosey, and he has his moments, he has his decent character moments, but his comedy lines and his very scatterbrained attitude, something about it just isn't working for me in this story. So yeah, there's definitely strengths to this one, but it hasn't gone up too far in my estimation. So anyway, moving on to... The Almost People in the Rebel Flesh is the first one of these that I'd say I straight up just think is bad. And like, it's got its strengths. It's actually a really effective horror piece because, like, the aesthetic, the direction, the lighting, the atmosphere, it's all, like, really dank and dark and heavy, and it's a really oppressive feeling episode the whole way through, and the visuals of the gangers and the flesh are actually really effectively horrifying. There's some pretty decent body horror throughout this story, and there's things about the way that it ends that I also like. The character of Jimmy, the guy who's got like his son who has his birthday today, and the Doctor using his son to like snap the ganger Jimmy out of this whole us versus them mentality by realizing that like his son deserves to have his real dad, and no matter how real he feels, it would be a disservice to his son to not get to speak to his actual original father. And like, that's a really well thought out bit of character writing. I had also completely forgotten that this episode is one where the Doctor knows the whole time the twist at the end, which is like the big twist for the audience when this episode came out was that Amy herself had been a flesh doppelganger for the entirety of Series 6 up to that point. And what I think is really fun is that that's not the actual twist. The actual twist is that the Doctor knew that the whole time, or at least knew that for a while, and has basically been pulling like a 7th Doctor style long con throughout this episode. So like from the beginning of this episode, he knows what the deal with Amy is, and he's like, in a way, using her not only to find out how the flesh works, but like using her to examine a person's prejudice, and that whole angle is really interesting. It's a really interesting bit of characterization for 11, that this is another story where he's keeping secrets and he's being a little bit Machiavellian. Now that stuff's good. What I do not care for is the characterization of everybody else in this story. Because, while Jimmy has like that one decent moment, this entire narrative is built on this extremely contrived us versus them mentality that all of these like factory workers have. And there's an idea that gets alluded to but isn't really made into the crux of anything, which is that it's inherently sort of off-putting to think that someone else could exist as a valid human being that is also just you. Like having someone with your memories and like everything, like they are you, and trying to accept that as like, do you have to share a sort of spiritual space as a pair of identical living things, that would like create a cognitive dissonance in someone so strong that they would immediately become tribal and even violent. I don't think the episode leans into that idea explicitly enough that it's actually justifying the extreme, like immediately extremely violent actions that these characters take, though. Human Cleves and Ganger Jennifer in particular are like the ringleaders of their respective factions, and they are just cutthroat, willing to murder and destroy for, like, I mean, not no reason, because Cleves doesn't see it as murder because she's used to thinking of the gangers as just hardware, basically. And the Ganger Jennifer has, like, the psychic memory of all of the other gangers and, like, being killed over and over and over again. But why only her and none of the other gangers? Hey, Hunter. Hunter's here. But yeah, why only her? The whole, like, psychic connection between the gangers, even though these gangers are only alive, like only have actual consciousness because of the solar storm, but we treat every ganger like they're inherently living beings, and are they not? I don't know. I think the mechanics of this are a little too vague. I think the story, like Curse of the Black Spot, cuts a lot of corners. The Doctor and his ganger having swapped shoes, but it's, I guess, then the real Doctor who has an extremely violent psychic reaction to all of the ganger's memories, while the ganger Doctor does not, is just, this episode feels like it's making a lot of weird choices. And then we've got the other guys, like Dickon and Buzzer, who may as well not be in this episode at all. You could, like, honestly cut either of them, cut both of them, make them one character, because, like, both of them are practically monosyllabic. They're basically just set dressing. They just kind of do whatever Cleves says. There's no reason to have both of these cast members here. And I don't know, I don't really know if there's, like, a clean fix for this, because this episode's issues are, I think, complicated. But I'm really, really put off by how immediately tribal everyone is, and it makes it very difficult to empathize with people. And Amy is super prejudiced in this episode, in a way that I find to be sort of out of character. She's just so dismissive of the Ganger Doctor. Every character in this story is so weird, except for the Doctor. Like, the Doctor is the only character who I think works. And in a different episode, that might have been enough to carry it, but here, I don't know, this story is just not good, I don't think. But anyway, now it's time for more horror with Night Terrors is another Gatiss episode, and it's alright. I don't know if this is a hot take, but I think this episode would be much better if we just removed Amy and Rory entirely. Like, something I'm picking up on with these Series 6 episodes is I don't know if they really know how to utilize Amy and Rory to their fullest extent. I think for some writers, if the episode isn't about the companions, or if the companion isn't, like, glued to the Doctor the whole time, I think it's just difficult for them to give companions things to do that are meaningful, because Amy and Rory spend basically the bulk of this episode stuck in this dollhouse, like slowly piecing together things that the Doctor will then put together in 5 seconds as soon as he shows up. And the Doctor has Alex, the dad of the boy George, being his Watson in this episode, basically. So I think this honestly could have been an episode where, like, maybe Amy and Rory are off on vacation or something, and the Doctor just comes in by himself and it's a Doctor solo episode. Because the premise that we've got going on with Alex and George is really interesting. And I honestly think if we managed the time a bit better and like really dove deep into pulling back the layers of that relationship and making the episode entirely about that, I really think there is an all-time great episode, like, inside of this story. It's, I can feel, I can taste it. Because you know what this is like? This episode is kind of like, sort of like a more benign, more sympathetic take on It's a Good Life, the Twilight Zone episode, with the kid who was like all-powerful and would send the adults to like purgatory whenever they did something he didn't like. This is like that if the kid wasn't fully conscious that he was doing it, and he was doing it out of fear instead of anger, and we had to resolve that by having him and the adult reach some understanding. Because the idea here that George is not Alex's biological son, he's an alien who just wants to fit in, just wants to be accepted, and goes into like this fear spiral because he's worried about being rejected and sent away, and so he's constantly throwing things into this like dollhouse space because he's scared of everything and like scared of being left behind. That's great. That's such a good idea. And the fact that Alex himself is clearly like a nervous guy who's got his own sort of anxieties, and that's like a feedback loop where father and son are kind of feeding each other's fears, and they just have to embrace each other to stop that cycle. Like, that's a really neat idea. And when we get that resolution, it does like get the warm fuzzies, and it is a very warm feeling ending. But I don't know. I think there's a version of this story that's better than okay, that is straight up like amazing if we lean a little bit more into that psychological aspect of it and make that the crux of the episode, like reveal George's true nature much earlier into the story so we can really spend more time on Alex accepting him anyway and the two of them becoming more confident both with each other and just in general. Like, I think that could be something really, really gold instead of what we have now, which is an episode where those gold ideas are just kind of rushed over because we use up a lot of screen time on Amy and Rory, just sort of wandering around and building up a creepy atmosphere. So yeah, this is another one that's not really bad at all, it's just not nearly as good as it could be, and that's a shame. But hey, if you think that's too soft, if you think I'm being too nice, wait until we talk about... I hate this one. I really dislike this one. I do not like Let's Kill Hitler at all. And I really had a strong reaction to this one as soon as it started, because I had completely forgotten about Mel's. My god, Mel's is so stupid. Introducing this brand new character who has allegedly been Amy and Rory's best friend throughout their whole lives, and yet we've not seen a hide nor hair of them, they've never mentioned them, and oh, they happen to conveniently be who they named their baby after because Melody is Melody. That's so stupid. And trying to like roundaboutly earn it with like these flashbacks, it doesn't work. And it's just, you know, for someone who values cleverness as much as Stephen Moffat, it's just such a remarkably unclever, like boneheaded writing move. I chafe against it so badly. And that's really indicative of the whole episode, I think. Because this whole episode just feels wrong. It feels not only like a first draft, it feels like something Stephen Moffat wrote out of obligation. Like he needed to have this chapter in the River Song storyline put on screen, and so he just does it, and it's not executed ideally at all, I don't think. Like, with the premise of the title, I don't think I will ever forgive this episode for wasting a premise as brilliant as the Doctor accidentally saves Hitler's life. And I know, I said I don't want to judge these episodes for what they aren't, I want to judge them for what they are, but every instinct I have as a critic, as a writer, as a viewer, every instinct goes against that premise and like making it into a goofy little like comedic aside in this episode where everything is just very glib and goofy and comedic, and I just want it to take itself seriously just for a minute. Now look, with the Hitler thing, maybe the problem here is that Stephen Moffat's just the wrong guy to handle that idea, and I mean that certainly might be true. Maybe the problem is that Doctor Who on TV can't, do that premise justice the way that I'd want to see it done, the way that something like Big Finish could. But if you're going to write the Doctor saves like history's greatest villain into your episode, like he does it by accident, I want to see the ramifications of that. I want to see a Doctor Who story where the Doctor is stuck with Adolf Hitler and like the TARDIS is out of commission for a while and the Doctor is stuck with Hitler whose life he just saved, and make that a dark, heavy, emotionally complex, nuanced character piece. Like, am I crazy? Is that not where you go with that? That seems to me like the most natural thing in the world, and that is like something genuinely boundary pushing that this show could do. And this show, this episode walks up to that opportunity and slams the door on it so hard it gives me whiplash for like the entire rest of the episode. It's insane to me. It just doesn't make any sense at all. But you know what? Forget it. Forget that. Like, let's forget the whole Hitler element of it even. If we ignore that, we've still got an episode that should be really emotionally heavy and just refuses to be, because this is Amy and Rory realizing that they've basically grown up with their daughter, because it gives us Mel's, and it plays into such broad comedy, I think, because the alternative would be acknowledging just how horrifying Amy and Rory's situation really is, where their daughter was kidnapped and they never really get to have her back. And like, this episode is going out of its way to try and give them and the audience like a balm for that, but I'm sorry, raising a daughter and growing up with a daughter is not the same thing. Having Amy and Rory grow up with their daughter as their friend is still something that should really weigh on them and like shift their whole perspective of their entire lives in a very, very heavy, very not funny way. But this episode refuses to play for anything other than the broadest of broad comedy for like 90% of the runtime. I just feel like the tone that this episode has is absolutely the wrong tone for all of this material. Like, none of the beats in this episode should play with the comedic broadness that they do. And it's just such a strange, borderline insulting choice, I think. That whole comedic, like, bit of one-upsmanship where River has, like, a plan to kill the Doctor, and he's like, oh, I knew you'd do that. Oh, well, I knew you knew. Well, I knew. Haha. It's too much. Like, it's just, this episode feels like it has to compensate for how obligatory it feels by just laying on the goofiness, and I don't care for it. I will give this episode this much. If you're going to lean into goofy comedy, then having the ostensible villain of the episode be going through a post-regeneration, like, weirdness is a fun way to do that. Because you only have so many adversarial characters in this show with the ability to regenerate, and we've never really done a post-regeneration episode for a villain. And like, River's not a villain, but she's like the villain of this episode. And that is a fun idea, because we always do like the Doctor being kind of whacked out and goofy and unpredictable in the immediacy of having regenerated, and doing that with the villain instead is a fun idea to hang a goofier episode on. I'll give it that. But I don't know. I feel like I'm not really justifying my feelings well here, because I'm just too angry at this episode. But I don't know, I don't even know if angry is the right word. This was a legitimately tough sit this time. Like, it was really hard to get through this episode, because I just feel like it made every wrong decision, from introducing Mel's to how it handles Hitler to just the tone of the whole thing to the pacing. I feel like the pacing is really off in this episode. I don't know. I do not think it works. I think it is really one of Moffat's weaker scripts. And like, man, I don't know, man. I really hope I can be kinder to Moffat for the next couple of these, because the next one is... The Wedding of River Song just doesn't have a whole lot going on. And yeah, I did a costume change. That happens. Get used to it. I don't know, rewatching this one for the first time in a while, it just felt like a real nothing of a story to me. It has its bits that are, like, fleetingly amusing, even if I don't like that it started this trend where Moffat feels the need to take a bunch of pretty cool high concepts that should be their own episodes and cram them into the space of a montage. He does that on this show and Sherlock constantly. It's really unfortunate. But that opening montage and flashback of the Doctor finding information through various sources is fun, even if I think the framing device with Winston Churchill is ultimately pointless. Just as pointless is the weird decision to have Amy and Rory lose their memories of each other. It doesn't factor into the plot at all, and honestly, neither do either of them as characters. This is just a really, really weakly plotted one. It feels like it's just kind of spinning its wheels and running around in circles, and while seeing the effects that violating a fixed point in time has is, I guess, nice, I don't think the Doctor has any kind of compelling character journey. And for the title character of the episode, River only really has a significant role in the second half, and even then isn't given all that much meat. I think Alex Kingston does a really good job performing the scene where she has to kill the Doctor, but outside of that, I don't know, this episode just doesn't have a whole bunch that grabs me. Madame Kovarian and the Silence were honestly never all that interesting to me as plot devices go, and I think this was a really lackluster way to end that whole joint. I'll give the episode this much. The scene with the brig remains, to this day, the best job that Moffat's ever managed to do as far as homaging that character and Nicholas Courtney as a performer. Every successive attempt at it has felt more and more cheap, almost like we're parading the name of Nicholas Courtney around for applause. But here it feels genuine and heartfelt, and you can feel not just the loss for the man and the character, but also the sense of regret through the screen of never getting to have the guy back on the show. It's a great moment, and Matt Smith utterly kills it, but it's really the only remotely memorable thing I find in this finale. Definitely one of the weaker series finales in my opinion, although speaking of unmemorable, I am not exaggerating at all when I say that I had forgotten that I watched The Doctor, the Widow, and the Wardrobe about 2 hours after I finished it. Like, Madge is a charming character, I suppose, but I don't think there's enough going on with the whole living trees side of the story to actually complement what she, Lily, and Cyril have. That's, in theory, a compelling source of drama, but I think it's undercut by the fact that Madge and her kids spend most of the episode torn apart. Having the Doctor, Lily, and Cyril just sort of meander around while Madge is stuck with the comedy space soldiers is unfortunately just a waste of what could have been a really unique and interesting dynamic for an episode. I also find the montage where the Doctor goes on this super over-the-top rant about all of the things that he's installed in the house and the editing gets super spastic and crazy to match is really, really obnoxious. I don't know, this one is angling for a lot of the same fairy tale come-to-life vibes that the previous Christmas special had, but I just don't think it has any of that genuine majesty or scale or sense of pathos to earn that ambition. The ending with the Doctor, Amy, and Rory is heartwarming and really, really compelling in a vacuum, but I don't think it's something that the rest of this episode builds up to naturally. Stories that aren't quite good enough to end really strong ending notes is sadly going to become a bit of a pattern throughout this video. It happened with New Earth, and it especially is happening here, I think. I suppose this story is harmless, but I just don't think there's all that much strength to it. Although, you know, I suppose it's better to be harmless than to be the next one. Asylum of the Daleks is trash, and I hate it. For one, is it just me, or should this have been a Cyberman story instead of a Dalek one? I don't know, I feel like all of the plot mechanics here just make infinitely more sense if we're doing it with the Cybies. I would much more easily believe that the Cybermen were willing to compromise or even recruit the Doctor on some kind of mission to salvage themselves. And the whole slowly converting a human into one of them thing just screams Cybermen. Really, I feel like this is indicative of a problem with Steven Moffat, where I don't think he ever quite realized how to tell a good Dalek story. He's told good stories that feature the Daleks, he's even told stories that handle the Daleks well. But a story where the Daleks are themselves a focal point only serves to reveal, I think, how little Moffat understands them as a character and as a concept. And that comes through in this story mainly in the way that it contradicts itself. The Daleks have long been established as not appreciating beauty as a concept, and yet the entire Asylum premise is built on the idea that they find beauty in hatred. This same idea gives way to the, I guess, interesting concept that they've maybe never killed the Doctor because they find his hatred beautiful, but then it turns out that this episode was all just a long con for them to try and kill him anyway. They try to convert humans into tools and then later into full-on Daleks, when we've established previously that the Daleks abhor any kind of genetic impurities. And most egregiously, we have the Doctor telling Amy mid-conversion to hold on to her fear because scared isn't Dalek, even though this entire plot is built on the idea that the Daleks are too scared to enter their own asylum. Part of me feels like I'm being really mean to Moffat for tackling so many of his episodes in a row, and this isn't even the last one of his that I'm going to be talking about, but man, this whole stretch of his era was just a really weak time for his own written output. The long-standing theory is that it's because this was around the time that he was showrunning both this and Sherlock. And yeah, if that's the case, I can really feel the sense of a man who's letting a shoddy script go by because he just has too many balls in the air. I don't super love the way that Clara is used here. I get that it's to the benefit of the audience's attachment to Clara as a concept to let her have a really big, broad first impression, but she has the same issue that I had with River in Let's Kill Hitler, which is that when Steven Moffat goes overboard with the comedic, flirty dialogue writing, it can get really, really obnoxious. Oswin feels like a caricature. Someone who I'm meant to think of as companion material in all of the best ways so that the twist of her situation lands all the more tragically. Frankly, I feel like that twist would land even harder if she was just written to come off a bit more natural. It takes a long time before Clara stops feeling like a typical, idealized, tropey version of Moffat's typical female character, and I think it might be at its worst in this and the next story. But even worse than all of that is our other big companion problem, and this is really what kills the story for me. The Daleks being written weird, Oswin being obnoxious, the Doctor not really having much of a compelling journey across the episode, I could deal with all of that, but it's Amy and Rory that just kill it. This is, once again, another story that honestly would have benefited from not having them in it at all. They contribute nothing to the plot, and what they contribute to the drama is insulting. Anger-inducing. I genuinely feel like this whole divorce subplot is disrespectful to these characters and disrespectful to my intelligence as a viewer. The idea that Amy would intentionally ostracize Rory, let it escalate all the way to getting a divorce and kicking him out of the house because she thinks she's, I don't know, doing him a favor because she can't give him kids? That is an astonishing lack of emotional maturity that I don't think is in character for Amy at any stage in her development. It is a shockingly mean, selfish thing that this episode tries to portray as loving and selfless. And the worst part is, it never comes up again, so I genuinely have to wonder what the point was. And let me tell you, coming right into this episode off of the ending of the last one makes this all the more glaring. Without the several months long break between episodes, jumping from the super heartwarming, super endearing and chummy ending of The Doctor, the Widow, and the Wardrobe, and then getting smacked in the face with all of this divorce nonsense not 5 minutes later, I gotta tell you, I don't know if I've ever experienced a worse mood whiplash. I genuinely want to know what Stephen Moffat was thinking when he came up with that plot point. Did he just feel like he had to force some kind of drama to justify the two of them being in this episode? Just do it without them! If you can't tell, this is one of the ones that makes me genuinely mad, so I'm gonna cut it off there and move on to... another Moffat Christmas special, second verse, same as the first. Okay, I am actually starting to feel a little bit mean and repetitive at this point, so after the Snowmen, I'm gonna lay off the Stephen Moffat written episodes for a little while. But appropriately enough, the Snowmen feels like a weird mix of all of the issues that the Doctor, the Widow, and the Wardrobe had, and all of the issues that Asylum of the Daleks had. Well, not all of the issues Asylum of the Daleks had, there's thankfully no stupid divorce subplot, but there is another incarnation of Clara who I think is characterized in a way that's just plain obnoxious. Once again, Moffat trying really, really hard to endear me to this character and want me to see her be a companion, only to pull the rug out from under us with a tragedy. And once again, I feel like it would land much better if I didn't think that so much of her dialogue was plain caricaturish. And really that goes for a lot of the dialogue throughout this whole story. The Paternoster gang are here, and while I think Jenny, Strax, and Vastra have a sort of charm to them, I'm never mad to see them in an episode. Vastra and Jenny in particular have this weird, sort of over-the-top, melodramatic, vampy quality to their dialogue that I've never really 100% gelled with, and a lot of the worst of it is in this episode. You want to talk about insulting my intelligence? The one-word scene is incredibly obnoxious and pointless. I don't understand why it was written this way. Does Moffat think he's being clever by, sort of forcing himself and the audience to undergo this weird dialogue exercise? I don't understand the purpose. And the biggest insult of all is that Clara would choose the word pond as her one-word summation of why the Doctor should get involved in help. It is legitimately stupid. It only makes sense if Clara is somehow a mind reader. Surely, if you had an angry, bitter, misanthropic doctor who wasn't willing to help, and you had to sum up why he should in one word, the word children should be it. But no, instead it's pond, because that's maybe the least interesting or important detail of this whole situation, but Clara got a copy of the script, so she knows what'll press the Doctor's buttons. Matt Smith seems to be having fun playing a more abrasive version of Eleven for the first half of the episode, but Richard E. Grant is wasted as Dr. Simeon, and Captain Latimer and his two kids, for being the ones who are ostensibly responsible for resolving the conflict through their feelings for Clara, are such non-characters. I don't even remember either of the kids' names. This is an episode with some nice presentation, it's got decent visuals, and Murray Gold comes to play as always, and I'll even give it has a decent sense of pacing and some jokes that land. But all of the emotional beats feel completely unearned to me, and the characterization all around just doesn't do it for me. But hey, I said I was going to lay off Moffat after this, so let's move on with... Journey to the Center of the TARDIS is such a waste of that premise. Honestly, aside from the fact that a time rift is a major plot point, I don't understand why this story had to be set in the TARDIS. You could have told this exact same story with the exact same emotional beats with any kind of labyrinth or sufficiently large spaceship. Frankly, it feels like the only reason it's a journey to the center of the TARDIS is as a weird ratings trap. Outside of one moment toward the very end, the Doctor's relationship with the TARDIS isn't utilized in any meaningful way, and none of the locations outside of generic hallways and corridors gets more than a minute of screen time. The one-off characters of the Van Balen brothers are really obnoxious. I think the story drastically underestimates just how much having the two older siblings pretend that their younger brother is a robot and treating him like a literal appliance makes them actually actively, disgustingly despicable. Like, that is any investment that I might have had in those characters flushed down the drain completely. Which is a shame because, they're not exactly the most fleshed out of characters before that twist is revealed, but there's something to their dynamic with Eleven that I think is kind of entertaining in a way that I can't articulate. I don't know, it's basically like watching the Doctor try to perform a rescue mission with Ed, Edd, and Eddy. But the whole episode is just a lot of running around, and the Doctor and Clara don't really get any interesting character work to themselves, until this moment towards the end where the Doctor rather arbitrarily confronts Clara as if she's supposed to know what exactly her own time displacement throughout the series is meant to be. It's a moment that comes out of nowhere and is quickly erased with no resolution. I could maybe buy into it as an indicator that the show understands how kind of unhealthy the Doctor's obsession with Clara is, but that's not really something that gets resolved or built on in future episodes. Overall, this one is just really generic, dismissible, skippable fluff. There's basically no meat on its bones. Gosh, tell me they're not all like this. Surprise! They're not all like this! The Caretaker is the kind of episode that makes me glad I took on this project. Not to say that it's anything spectacular, but it is a much better story than I remember. And it's given me a newfound appreciation for Danny Pink of all characters. Danny is a guy that I found really boring and hard to engage with on my first viewing of Series 8, to the point that he was one of my main problems with it. Now, having rewatched through a couple of Series 8 episodes, I think he might actually be one of the best things about the season. I don't know, I think teenage me maybe just had trouble accepting such a grounded, emotionally mature adult character as part of the dynamic of this show in a way that wasn't meant to be a comedic foil of some kind. Danny is kind of like what happens if you took Rory and removed all of the traits that are supposed to be kind of pathetic and funny about him. In this dynamic, he's very much the adult grounding force that Clara and 12 need because they're both varying degrees of emotionally immature and have pretty massive egos. I really like the way that that's conveyed in the opening montage of this episode, where Clara clearly has too much on her plate and yet psychs herself up into believing that she can do basically anything. Series 8 is where we give Clara a really solid characterization as someone with a practiced ego and self-confidence to match the Doctor, and this episode does a really good job of displaying why Danny is necessary to keep these two from going completely off the rails. I like that Clara is actually the audience's main point of view character throughout this episode, and we get to experience all of her stress as she tries to keep the Doctor and Danny out of each other's orbit and then eventually try and make them coalesce. I also just think stopping an alien weapon from attacking Coal Hill School by infiltrating the faculty is a fun premise to run with, and I think the episode utilizes it well. The one aspect of it that I don't quite care for as much is how we characterize the Doctor himself. Frankly, the whole of Series 8 feels like it's overcompensating big time to differentiate the 12th Doctor from the 11th. And as a result, Peter Capaldi is unfortunately stuck with a lot of scripts where the Doctor isn't just darker and more morally ambiguous, he's outright mean, emotionally cruel, and frankly very childish in a way that I find kind of abrasive and difficult to watch. I don't know, I was just really endeared to Danny on this viewing of the episode, and the Doctor's kind of gross, petty, unwarranted sniping at him just because he's a soldier just felt icky. The whole anti-soldier character trait is a thing that never made sense. It doesn't even seem like all of the writers on Series 8 agree with what the take there is supposed to be. And whenever 12 has to interact with Danny, it just seems like he's needlessly condescending. The bits where he's decently entertaining are the brief scenes that he has with Courtney, though. I don't know, overall, the Caretaker was just a really pleasant surprise. An episode that I remembered being totally dismissible, much like Journey to the Center of the TARDIS, ended up being a pretty fun one that I might actually go back to voluntarily sometime. Which actually makes this the first episode on this list since the Lazarus Experiment that I can say that about. Congratulations, the Caretaker, you are officially in the decent enough that I might watch you again without some kind of external impetus pile. But, the next one... Kill the Moon is trash and I hate it. Man, I just don't know what happened with this one. Once again, the big problem here is the characterization of the 12th Doctor. I don't understand what it is about this conflict that makes him decide to up and dip in the most childish way possible. It's just such a remarkably out-of-character, un-Doctor move for him to coldly, callously leave these three poor ladies in charge of deciding the fate of the planet and/or this innocent creature. This whole rigmarole with him not knowing where the future of the time stream goes from this moment seems like it's meant to justify this narratively, but watching it in the moment, I just can't help but feel like no version of the Doctor would ever go about this situation in this way. And granted, when we get to the end of the episode and Clara blows up at the Doctor in a moment that is brilliantly delivered by Jenna Coleman, that moment at least makes it clear that the Doctor's emotional immaturity is a conscious character trait, but I just don't feel like it's earned. It felt cheap, not just on the Doctor's part, but on Peter Harness's part. So I'm left being just as angry at the show as Clara is at the Doctor. Only I can't sympathize too much with Clara because, unlike the show, I don't think she made the right choice. Through the astronaut lady whose name I forget and the scene at the end, the show seems pretty adamant that Clara ultimately made the right decision in not trying to kill the moon creature. But I'm sorry, I can't meet this episode on those moral terms. This, more than any other story on this list, is one that I'd like to hear people's thoughts on in the comments, because I feel like this is a very, very subjective thing. But my morality just will not allow me to sympathize with a character who would risk endangering the entire planet because they don't want the blood of one creature on their hands. I don't care how unique or how beautiful that creature is, I don't think Clara or the Doctor, if they're written like themselves, would find this to be a difficult choice at all. I don't think any decent person in this character's shoes would hold the stance so adamantly that this one life is worth the risk that it might represent to an entire planet full of men and women and children, and just, ugh. I am 100% with Astronaut Lady throughout the entire conflict. And when the episode tries to use her as a mouthpiece to say that her stance was wrong, I just find that frankly very insulting. And we get to sweep all of that dubious morality under the rug because it so conveniently turned out that this moon creature wasn't even remotely dangerous and also left a conveniently moon-sized egg in its wake immediately after it hatches. I'm sorry, no. The moon being an egg by itself is a premise that I find difficult to swallow. That, on top of everything else, is just too many gimmies for an episode to ask of me. Slap this one on the list of episodes that doesn't remotely earn having an ending as good as it does. Because Clara blowing up at the Doctor and the conversation she has with Danny afterward is actually really, really well written and performed stuff. And I wish that it had been built to with an episode that wasn't as taxing for me as it was for its characters. If someone told me that they dropped the show after watching this episode, the way that Clara drops the Doctor, then I honest to God wouldn't blame them. It is that literally offensive to my sensibilities. Also, as someone who found Courtney kind of charming in The Caretaker, her dialogue is really, really ropey in Kill the Moon. Her character is frankly kind of obnoxious, and it seems like maybe they just don't know how to write her. Even if the rest of the episode didn't get on my nerves, she would definitely be an issue. Let's move on. In the Forest of the Night is another sort of harmlessly dull one, although it does unfortunately share some issues with Kill the Moon. Not nearly to the extremes that episode had, but this is yet another story where I think Clara makes some really morally odd, out-of-character decisions. Specifically, when we get to around the 2/3 mark and it seems like there's no clear solution for how to stop the Earth from being destroyed, and what Clara chooses to do is basically trick the Doctor into abandoning humanity so he can save his own skin. I get that it's supposed to be like a meaningful friendship moment, but it does not say great things about Clara Oswin Oswald, that she spends more time doing that than she does thinking of a solution to the problem that might allow everyone on Earth to live. I don't know, just these two stories really, really make me think less of her character as a even remotely moral human being. And it doesn't seem like it's remotely on purpose or something that the episode wants me to think about. I also got a question with this episode: what grade Danny and Clara even teach? Because all of the kids here are significantly younger than Courtney, seemingly. The kids are all cute, dismissible little bits of comic relief. Something I actually quite like about this episode conceptually is just the idea of the Doctor unwittingly leading a school field trip. The character of Maeve, though, is again where I take some issues. She's someone who's been struggling mentally since the loss of a family member, and this episode leaps over the line into making the textual message of its story that we should take traumatized children off of medication. And it's so glib and confident with that idea too, it just really rubs me the wrong way. And again, that's probably just a me thing. If anyone knows my background, then yeah, that probably has a lot to do with how I react to that plot thread. But I don't know, I just don't like it one bit. Much like Kill the Moon, I also find the premise of this one to just be a bit too big of a pill to swallow. The whole trees are alive and sentient and spring up whenever the Earth needs cover from a specific natural disaster, I just don't buy it, and even if I did, I don't find it very compelling. Once again, Danny Pink manages to be the highlight of the episode. All of the scenes with him just being a really decent, selfless guy with all of his priorities in place. It's just really neat. And you know, my newfound appreciation for his and Clara's relationship really reframes my view of Clara's arc going forward as that much more tragic. Without Danny in her life, this character really spirals in Series 9. And you know, I wish the show had done more with that as an explicit surface level thing that's going on with her. But yeah, I'm starting to feel like a broken record again. This is another episode where the Doctor is just a little bit too much of a jerk, Clara is a bit too amoral, and the premise is a bit too far-fetched for me to get behind. Not one that I think really benefited from the rewatch, unfortunately. And we're back here, finishing off with the last story in this little marathon, Series 9's Sleep No More. Now, this one is interesting. It's another Mark Gatiss episode, and it's another one that makes me glad that I took on this project. Not because I think it's particularly good, but because it was actually my least favorite episode of this show for many years. And, you know, I still don't really care for it, but matched up against a lot of the other ones that I've talked about in this video, I don't know, I can't help but be grateful for the perspective that I've been given. Because, you know, Sleep No More is harmless. It's an interesting premise on paper, even if sleep crust monsters is something that I find hard to swallow in the same way I do the moon being an egg. But, you know, there's nothing in it that I feel is insulting to my intelligence, nothing about it makes me mad, I don't feel like anyone is particularly out of character. Its worst crime is that it's really just kind of dull. And that, weirdly enough, the interesting aspects of its premise actually seem to work against it. There's a sort of double twist here, one of which is just kind of strange, and one of which is really stupid. The former being that this is a found footage style episode, compiled by the villain with the intent of spreading a sort of electromagnetic virus by people watching it. I don't know, that's really strange, but it's also sort of cool. A really neat meta concept where the villain scheme of the episode is getting people to watch the episode. It's one of those things that I really think belongs in a better story. I can't believe that this random, ultimately unremarkable episode in Series 9 is the one to grab that premise and do basically nothing with it. The latter, much dumber twist being that all of this footage wasn't recorded by actual cameras, but by particles of sleep dust functioning as cameras. It's not just me, right? That's like an episode-breaking level of stupid. And I don't know, it's all packaged with this reveal scene where the bad guy talks about wanting to make this story as exciting as possible so that he would ensure that people watch it. But the irony there is, it's just not exciting. It's no longer my least favorite episode of the show, not by a wide margin, but it's not one that I think I'll ever end up going back to. None of the characters really get any standout moments or compelling characterization. Everyone is just kind of going through the motions. The setting is generic, I don't find the sleep crust monsters to be all that intimidating. There's not even enough material here for the performers to work any real magic. It's just kind of the most base-level, dismissible diversion of a Doctor Who episode. And you know, hey, that might seem like a bit of a whimper to end this all on, but for a long time, this was my bottom-of-the-barrel poop standard Doctor Who story. And there's something somewhat comforting, I think, about knowing that not only have there been worse episodes of this show before and since, but that even the episodes which I do think are markedly worse than this one are at least interesting to talk about. I've certainly had an interesting time talking about them here. 17 is a lot of stories to go through, and I kind of got carried away with myself on this project, I think. Like I mentioned at the start, there's a bunch of episodes which I could have tackled here, but I didn't because I didn't want an even heavier workload for myself, and because I might do another video like this if there's enough interest. Lordy knows you don't have to go through all 17 in any sort of comment response, but if there's an episode here that you feel particularly strongly about, whether it's agreeing with me or the total opposite, why don't you let me know in the comments? Like and subscribe if you haven't already, and let me know if this whole multiple episodes in one video is a format that I should tackle for other shows.